Story 1. My parents are wealthy, but I grew up in a place where many of my peers' parents were extremely wealthy, so I had a really skewed understanding of wealth. It was really eye-opening for me when I went to college. I didn't have to take out student loans. My parents were able to just pay for it, but I had friends who, even with financial aid, had to work very hard year-round to cover the cost of school. I realized pretty quickly just how privileged I was and that I did, in fact, grow up with wealth. Story 2. When I was confused about people on Maury complaining their spouse was at the club, I couldn't figure out what type of country club would let people like that through the front security gate. Story 3. I don't really come from wealth, just solidly upper middle class, but as part of my job I do home visits and have many clients who are poor. When I first started my career in my 20s, I was shocked to discover there were people in the United States who lived in homes with no indoor plumbing or electricity, with dirt floors or had outdoor kitchens. It was not like a barbecue setup. There was no kitchen inside where they lived, so they had to cook on an oil drum outside. I had no idea. Story 4. I was going to say I realized how privileged I was when I spent a summer with my great-grandmother in a small village in rural Hungary. There was no indoor running water, the only phone was at the church, and everyone came out to touch the rental car we drove there in. This was in the late 1980s. But after reading some of the comments on here, I feel poor again, laughing out loud. Story 5. Becoming an adult and realizing that I have extremely good role models as parents because when they have disagreements, they talk them out, and I have never heard them argue or speak poorly of each other. I also realized that as a child, my parents got me the mental health help that I needed, even though it was expensive, and continued that care for as long as I have needed it. A third one that doesn't seem like much but has had a huge impact was being taught financial literacy from a young age, to budget my money and only buy the things I really want. Story 6. I have an uncle who has money. I was a wild madman of a kid, had a lot of psychological stuff going on, and had lots of legal issues from the time I was really young, from 11 onwards. I spent about 10 years going in and out of juvenile detention centers and jails and had a bunch of court cases. Every time I was in court, I had a private lawyer. These lawyers would fight for me. You could not violate my rights because my lawyer would make a scene about it. You could not attempt to intimidate me into a plea deal, regardless of whether I even did something or if it was one of the cases where I was falsely accused, because my lawyers would fight right back and challenge the prosecutor to take it to trial. Then the prosecutor would generally give up because they knew they couldn't actually prove that particular allegation. The reason that I didn't end up in prison, despite my various attempts to, is because of the lawyers. My uncle also paid a lot of money to get me into treatment programs and rehab, put me into a really good school, got me counselors, got me everything I needed, and he saved my life. I turned out to be just a normal, chill person by my early 20s. I met so many people in the system who will never have any of that, people who need help and who will never receive it. The system does nothing in terms of root causes of criminality. It does nothing to prevent recidivism. It does nothing. Court is nothing but a chess game on a conveyor belt, and people get screwed over every day. I would also like to point out that I'm not disparaging public defenders. There are many passionate public defenders who do excellent work, but their caseloads are too big. They cannot allocate endless time to a person's case because they don't have the time. Public defense needs way more funding than it gets. Story 7. Every summer, I went to 8 weeks of overnight camp or some other cool summer program. I once took a 30-day bus tour across the western United States and spent 3 weeks in Australia. I had no idea what those cost at the time. Story 8. I did not grow up wealthy. We were a single-income household, and my dad made around $30,000 most of my childhood in the 1990s. That was decent in the 90s, but there were several of us kids. However, my grandparents are very wealthy. My dad worked for them, but they just didn't pay him well. I work in finance, and I've seen their old pay stubs, so I know. My grandfather was just an old man anyway. Good man, but old-fashioned and wouldn't pay for much. Anyway, it dawned on me how wealthy my family was when I started looking for a real job about 15 years ago. I had worked multiple jobs because my parents were like, if you want a phone and car, etc., you are on your own. I was talking to my father about getting my finance degree. A week later, one of the wealthiest men in the area who owns several businesses called me. He said, Your father said you're studying finance. We're hiring in a certain company. Send your resume to my secretary. Then my father called and said, "Hey, I heard you got a job at that company." I hadn't even sent the resume. I didn't know my father knew him. After that, I thought about many little occurrences over my life. Although I was never given money directly from my parents or grandparents, they opened doors for me. I talked to my dad about it a couple of years ago. He said, "I've recently inherited more money than I'll ever need. Your father always told me to live life like I'll never inherit a penny, and I encourage you to act the same." Many folks are given money and have no skills to manage it. We wanted to give you the skills in case you are given money. I personally was not wealthy, but I have definitely been privileged. Story 9. When I went to my husband's parents' house for the first time, after dinner, the mom wheeled in a dishwasher and hooked it up to the kitchen faucet. I'd never seen or heard of this type of dishwasher. Story 10. At this point, I already knew I was very well off, but after I had gotten laid off for the first time a few years ago, I took a break for about a month before diving into a job search. I was at the self-checkout at the grocery store next to a woman paying with food stamps. I had recently received $100,000 from my grandmother's inheritance, and it hit me. I am unemployed, not even trying to find a job, and I just got a boatload of money because somebody else died. And she's the one people think is the freeloader. Story 11. Answering for my privileged 14-year-old daughter, we are most definitely not wealthy. Just okay day to day when she arrogantly corrected a friend that Spotify does not have ads. Story 12. I never took public transit until I was 16 as an experience to have with friends versus actually needing to get somewhere, since I was always driven around and wondered why my friends would say our car is nice when I thought it was just a regular car. I later found out it was a Porsche Cayenne Turbo GT. Story 13. My parents loved to travel. By the time I was 16, I had been to every continent aside from Antarctica. I didn't realize that this was privileged behavior until I went to university and most of the guys I met had never left the country. In fact, I grew up thinking I was less privileged because everyone at my school was just obscenely rich. All their stuff was high-end designer while I was in Converse. Story 14. When I met my wife, we were in high school. We were both involved in marching band, and the band takes a trip out of state every 2 years. My senior year, the trip was to Washington, D.C. Even though it was a school-sponsored trip, you still had to pay a fee to go. The fee was $1,200. That covered the whole trip as far as room and board, airfare, and bus rentals. Pretty much everything except if you wanted to buy personal stuff. You could make 6 payments or something to make it more affordable for folks. I remember my mom just wrote me a $1,200 check like it was nothing. When talking to my wife, she wasn't even my girlfriend at the time, just a cute girl with a big booty. She was saying she didn't even know if she could go because $1,200 is a lot of money. I was like, just have your parents write a check. Easy. She looked and was like, yeah. My parents don't just have $1,200 to drop like that. Turns out a lot of other parents didn't either. When the paid-up list came out, only me and maybe 2 other kids were fully paid up by the time the first payment was due. There are other things, but that's one that sticks in my brain. I had no idea this girl I was talking to was going to be my wife, which is cool too. I married that cute girl with a big booty, and we're poor together. Story 15. I had a few, to be honest. It wasn't one moment, more of many smaller things. As an older teenager or young man, I would hang out with some guys from poorer backgrounds and honestly tried to assimilate a bit. I was pretty lost back then, and I'm also black, so being preppy or rich wasn't exactly cool. One time in particular was when a guy started to laugh at me and was asking me all these personal questions. Then he said, "You're rich, bro." And it hit me that I was subtly in denial about it. Story 16. When I was a kid, my best friend came to our house for the first time. He kept saying, "Wow." He was really impressed that we had 2 televisions. It embarrassed me enough that I didn't tell him we had 4. Story 17. Realizing how lucky I was for my parents to pay for my car to get me a good, reliable car that I will have for years to come, and taking care of the maintenance for it. Story 18. I wasn't wealthy compared to national averages, but my parents made around $100,000 in the 90s, And I lived in a small and economically disadvantaged town, so I was definitely part of the 1%. In middle school, my friend lived in a trailer. I had stayed the night at her house, and while I was surprised by the inconvenience of how small it was, that actually wasn't a wake-up call because I had been in trailers before. When she finally came over to my typical 90s-built home, 2-story, 3-bedroom, she said, "You can't even see the whole house all at once. It just keeps going." I had never seen my life through someone else's eyes before, and it definitely made me more grateful. Story 19. I forgot to take my laundry downstairs one week, but I still had plenty of clothes to get through a second week. A couple of people asked if I had ruined my old clothes beyond the point of being able to wear them again and if that was why I got new stuff. It was then that I realized those people wore the same clothes every single week in different orders. Story 20. I did not grow up wealthy, more like comfortable. I heard stories about how kids only got to eat meals at school or skipped meals at home because there was not a lot. I was not wealthy, but I still had some privileges. I never had to skip a meal or portion control to have food for later. Story 21. They are really stupid, really, but I have two. The first is the first time I threw something into a friend's drain. I think it was an apple core, and his mom had to tell me that they threw them away. I proceeded to ask why they didn't use their garbage disposal, and yes, they didn't have one. Later in life, it was solidified in my mind that there are a lot of homes that don't have one. The second was in the Middle East, with the realization that not everyone, not only in the Middle East, obviously, has water to bathe in or drink and enough food. It's one thing to see the news or the sad charity commercials, but quite another to have those scenes play out in real life and be ordered to get involved. Anyway, yes, first world problems, I guess. Story 22. I don't think I ever really had a wake-up call moment. I knew from a young age my dad had done well for himself. So I'd have to say my parents and traveling back to Europe influenced me. My parents lived well, but below their means. My dad, until the day he died, always considered himself a simple Balkan peasant. Traveling to their home country every year also let me see a large disparity in how people live, which I think made a huge difference in my life. I realized at a very young age that I was privileged. Story 23. My oldest brother was raised by grandparents in another country. I remember when he moved to the United States after turning 18, he was in awe of seeing a garage door automatically open. That's when I realized we grew up very differently from him. Sad, really, but he certainly rose and became the most successful of all us siblings. Story 24. I grew up middle class, but in a very poor area. People thought we were rich because my parents each had their own car and we lived in a brick house rather than a trailer or shack. Story 25. Not me, but my cousin. I lived in an apartment with 2 windows without central air. So in the summer it was really humid and hot inside, both night and day. She asked me why I couldn't just turn the air on because she's really hot and can't sleep. Girl, go get a cold wash rag and go to bed. Story 26. When I was in high school, I had to volunteer 20 hours or something of community service for National Honor Society. I always loved kids, so I ended up volunteering at this women and children's shelter my mom always donated our clothes to. I basically just played with the babies and toddlers with a staff member always there on Sunday while parents were at the church service that I guess was part of the requirement to stay at the shelter. I can't remember exactly, but one Sunday, a mom came to pick up her baby and she was super agitated. She just started screaming at the kid and taking out a lot of frustration on him verbally. I don't remember exactly what she said, but she screamed a bunch of profanities at the child. It was jarring because I don't think I'd ever seen anyone act that way, and certainly never directed at a toddler. I remember realizing that I hadn't even learned those words until I was like 10 years old, and my parents had never, ever talked to me that way. It was this profound moment for me, and the first time I remember wondering how differently my life might have turned out if I'd been raised any differently than I had, which was in a super loving and nurturing household with 2 kind and gentle parents. This isn't to say that the mom who screamed at her kid wasn't a loving or kind parent. Maybe she was, and I saw her on a bad day. I like to hope so. It was just eye-opening for me that some kids do go through all that and worse for their entire childhoods, and I never had to endure a second of mistreatment. It made me realize how set up I was to succeed by forces beyond my control, which is maybe the definition of privilege. Story 27. Dad was an engineer, so professional wealth, but not like don't give a fuss wealth. Probably hearing about a kid whose family had to give his dog away due to the cost in elementary school. Giving away our dog wasn't on the radar or even on the table. But it was only out of the question because my parents had the money for it to be out of the question.